All of us know this name incredibly well, Linda Moulton Howe. She has something as a television producer I hope to one day get. She is an Emmy award-winning television producer and an unbelievable journalist who has devoted her skills to the UFO phenomena in trying to figure out the truth. Tonight's lecture, Linda is going to be talking about the United States government denial of UFO crash retrievals in the interest of national security. You can check out a lot of her research and unbelievable news stories. You can keep up to date on just about anything that's going on her website at earthfiles.com. Linda is a dear friend of mine. She has been a big help in my research and in the work that I have done, and it is an absolute honor to bring to the stage Linda Moulton Howe.
Thank you, John, so much. Thank you. Thank you. It is satisfying to me to return to a MUFON conference where I remember the first one that I ever spoke or presented was in Houston, Texas in 1980. And that was after the first broadcast of the television program I had done, A Strange Harvest, trying to get to the bottom of the, I thought, Colorado and then region and then Northern Hemisphere, and then realized Southern Hemisphere and the global phenomenon of animal mutilations that law enforcement kept linking for me to something from outer space. And that when I was at that first MUFON conference in 1980, what I remember was a feeling by many people who did not want this to be true, did not want the link between unidentified beautiful lights in the sky and the repulsive animal mutilations on the ground to have any link at all. And now it is 27 years later almost. And in this leading many kinds of journalistic lives of investigating global warming and many other subjects, the one thing that has dominated my own mind and my own search has been, what does the government of the United States know? And why would something as big as an extraterrestrial presence on this planet interacting with Earth life, why would this be kept from the human family that should deserve to know, especially in the United States of America, what its elected leaders are supposed to be basing their decisions on what the general populace contributes in terms of not only tax dollars, but having knowledge and an evolution in this country. And for some of you who are familiar with my two-volume book, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 1 and 2, I have a very large military section in Volume 2, as well as a lot about animal mutilations, crop circles, and government knowledge and cover-up having to do with the human abduction syndrome in Volume 1. And I'm referencing them because several people have asked me if I had them here and they wanted some autographed copies, and they are so big and so heavy that I don't travel with them, and I often don't ship because I just say, please go to my news website, earthfiles.com, where those books are always available. And I reference them because what I'm going to share with you tonight has really grown out of the work and the contacts and the discussions that I had in preparing Glimpses of Volume 1 and Volume 2 that took a decade to produce. And that I can tell you firsthand that there were some people in Washington, D.C. who were really, really angry at some of the information in Glimpses Volume 2. And that's fine. They can be angry. You and I are not criminals. We are trying to find facts about something as astonishing as an extraterrestrial presence on a planet in which we were told it doesn't exist. And in this evolution that I've had as a journalist and as a TV producer, trying to get to the bottom of a subject that has kept proliferating, becoming more complex and more astonishing each year, one of the people that I have respected the most over the last 2-3 decades since I first met him is John Schuessler, and the courage and the persistence that he had on the Cash Landrum case in Texas. And I would like myself right now to pause and to give a hand of applause to a man who's been a leader. John, wherever you are. Thank you for persisting with your work and for sustaining MUFON and for continuing in your own efforts to try to support as it is transitioning to new leadership, which hopefully will expand into what I consider to be some of the most important work, and that is the hard, slugging, physical evidence. It's hard work to go into the field. It's hard work to approach animals that smell like something you'd like to run away from rather than cut tissue from. But those are the data points that have helped get me to this moment standing before you in, I hope, sharing with what I think are some of the hard facts about why this government, in cooperation with other governments for at least 60 years, has had a policy of denial in the interest of national security. It was a little more than a decade ago, in the early 1990s, that a Las Cruces, New Mexico resident named Andrew Kistner met me to talk about leaked documents and information from 2 military sources at White Sands Missile Range. Their information was about our government's military aggression in the 1940s and 1950s against an alien disc technology, the disc technology's retaliation, and the American government clamped down to keep the truth from the media and the public. It was in the late 1990s that Andy Kistner decided that he would run for office in the state of New Mexico and was elected state representative for Doña Ana County, where he lived, which was in Las Cruces, not far from the White Sands Missile Range. During Andrew Kistner's 2 years in state government, he was frustrated by the firm blocks around the alleged 1947 UFO crashes in the very region that he was representing in New Mexico government, and was getting private, secret information coming from Naval Research Lab and White Sands contacts, but couldn't make a dent as a politician in the state trying to get to the bottom of what the government knew and why it was covering it up. But he did contact Congressman Steve Schiff of New Mexico in the congressman's own effort to open up more facts about the Roswell events. But even that congressman was blocked, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Andy Kistner told me that his private White Sands sources not only told him many details about the disc technology that they categorized as extraterrestrial, but that the sources had an explanation for why there has been such a strict government policy of denial about the facts since the early 1940s and perhaps before. And as I am going to move forward with these insights from Andy Kistner's investigation, I would first like to set the stage a little bit with what was being discussed among President Harry S. Truman's Majestic 12 Special Studies Group assigned to investigate the extraterrestrial biological presence on Earth in his special executive order dated September 24th, 1947. And this is according to alleged government documents leaked to aerospace engineer Bob Wood, PhD, and his son Ryan, who I think most of you are well acquainted with and Majestic 12, www.majesticdocuments.com, is one of the most important resources on the net. They have been investigating Majestic 12 documents for at least 15 years, and the Majestic 12 group and a Majestic 12 panel. There were some common people to the panel and the group, such as Vannevar Bush, but there were also, it was an expanded group that took advantage, from Truman's point of view, of the best minds in science, in medicine, in military, and in the corporate business world that apparently the administrations were having to depend upon in highly classified ways in order to accomplish some of the work that the military could not. These people were picked by President Truman, and they form the body of perhaps the most important documents that have been leaked, that Bob and Ryan Wood have been investigating for a long time, and from which I am going to be drawing some information tonight. It looks like that I don't have there. In September 24, 1947, the MJ-12 mission statement, there was a preliminary white-hot intelligence assessment. It referenced another highly classified retrieval of an unidentified lenticular aerial technology that was abbreviated as ULOT 1. That disk was in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and the year was 1941. What was retrieved? The Craft's propulsion system that was called in this document and another document a, quote, neutronic propulsion system or neutronic power plant. Both phrases were used. And who studied this neutronic power plant? It was handed over to physicist Robert Oppenheimer, is the implication, head of the top-secret Manhattan Project in Los Alamos, which created the first atomic bombs dropped in Japan in 1945. These leaked Majestic 12 documents indicate that the United States government already had extraterrestrial hardware and perhaps entities both dead and alive long before the New Mexico crashes in July of 1947. The MJ-12 first annual report of 1952 begins, quote, a review of the President's special panel to investigate the capture of unidentified planned-form space vehicles by U.S. armed forces and agencies. And planned-form means flat and curved. The panel concluded a consensus reached by members of the panel that until positive proof that the Russians did not attempt a series of reconnaissance flights over our most secure installations, the sightings and recovered objects are interplanetary in nature, unquote. In paragraph I of that same report, the MJ-12 panel stated, quote, V-2 rocket launches at the White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico, have been knocked down by undetermined jamming. The source of the jamming is believed to come from UFO sightings on or near the range. Guidance systems are believed to be vulnerable, and this presents a clear and present danger. Such keeper flights carrying nuclear weapons are too horrific to contemplate. Shielding of systems and circuits are underway. As to purpose and modus operandi, we are not certain, but it is clear that if these visitors had conquest in mind, it would not be difficult for them, given their ability to penetrate our airspace at will and their ability to jam radio, television, telephone, and teletype transmissions, let alone the power grids, unquote. Well, did the United States government share these astonishing facts with other leaders on this planet? Paragraph L, entitled Foreign Policy and National Security, states, quote, to date, only Great Britain, Canada, and the Soviet Union are contacted and appraised in the event invasion is imminent. It is the current policy of the administration that no other foreign countries will be consulted or advised. The national security status of the Majestic operation exceeds that of the H-bomb development. It has been the downfall of great nations and cultures when a new reality is not readily accepted by the masses. The social order was severely ravaged by the last World War, with great damage to the religious dogma of earth without end, thus making a government disclosure irresponsible and inherently dangerous, unquote. Under paragraph P, government policy of control and denial, MJ-12 expressed concern about controlling the press and said, quote, "It is the recommendation of the President's Special Panel with concurrence from Majestic 12 that a policy of strict denial of the events surfacing from Roswell, New Mexico, and any other incident of such caliber be enforced. An interactive program of controlled releases to the media in such fashion to discredit any civilian investigation be instituted in accordance with the provisions of the 1947 National Security Act," unquote. In Annex B, paragraph 21, the panel chairman, who was MIT physicist Vannevar Bush, PhD, argued for, quote, "funding air defense projects that would be useful in combating the new menace." That's Vannevar Bush's term for the discs, new menace. Instead of developing ballistic missiles which have proved to be useless, and he meant in attacking the discs. President Truman had appointed Vannevar Bush to be head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, also known as OSRD, and OSRD's largest project was the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos. Vannevar Bush was also in the President's Majestic 12 group to study the extraterrestrial presence. The MJ-12 panel added an Annex C, paragraphs 2 to 3, in their first annual report that warned, quote, "Men, equipment, weapons vanish without a trace. In all instances, the disappearances occurred in tropical climate and in the heat of battle or near combat zones. Missing aircraft, pilots, and crew are of special concern to the military when no explanations fit the usual reasons outside of combat. One such incident is the disappearance of a flight of 5 U.S. Navy TBM-3 Avenger torpedo bombers from the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida on 5 December 1945. It is believed that Flight 19 encountered a phenomenon of celestial nature. Celestial refers to the sky or heavens. The last known radio transmission from the instructor pilot was heard by a ham operator, and it was, 'Don't come after me. They look like they are from outer space. I'm at 2,300 feet. Don't come after me,' unquote." And then 2 years later, on January 7th, 1948, and about 7 months after the Roswell UFO crashes, U.S. Air Force Captain Thomas Mantell tried to pursue a large silver disk near Godman Air Force Base, Kentucky, but he died in the subsequent crash of his plane. The Majestic 12 panel quoted the last radio transmission from Captain Mantell, quote, "It appears to be a metallic object, and it is of tremendous size," unquote. The panel further explained that when Godman personnel arrived at the crash scene, Mantell's F-51 was found in many pieces, not large sections, as one would from a free stick descent. The wreckage contained unusual damage, as if Mantell's plane was repeatedly hit by shotgun blasts. Some of the metal had pitted surfaces and unusual scoring. All rubber material had disintegrated in a soft, powdery substance. There was no indication of gunfire damage or fuel burn. The crash site and debris exhibited an unusually high amount of radiation of undetermined nature. MJ-12's Annex C, paragraph 5 continued from 1949 to late 1950, there have been several crashes of B-36 bombers on routine Arctic patrol that bear all the earmarks of the Mantell incident. None of the crews were found. The atomic bombs were not recovered, thus creating a serious problem for the Air Force when nuclear weapons are lost over friendly countries, unquote. So government insiders say that the Majestic 12 group under President Harry S. Truman was at first trying to carry out a secret war against the disk technology until the human military effort proved futile. Details about that secret war began to emerge for me first from former U.S. Air Force and UFO investigator Leonard Stringfield. It was back around 1984, and Len told me he had firsthand knowledge from the years when he was working out of Dayton and was working on his sort of colleagueship with some people in the Air Force on UFO reports. He said that the Air Force had a standing order to shoot down the UFO disks and other unidentified aerial objects, but Len said, quote, "We lost so many planes and pilots trying to carry out that order that it was rescinded in the early 1950s, unquote." Well, in the mid-1990s, former New Mexico State Representative Andrew Kistner told me about his official research into the 1947 V-2 rocket program and into UFO crashes and retrievals in New Mexico, and his offhand, off-the-record conversations with military and intelligence operatives from White Sands Missile Range and the Naval Research Lab housed at White Sands. Kistner had assembled many old newspaper articles and some leaked documents under the guidance of these sources at White Sands, and he showed many of them to me. And he asserted that in the 1940s to early 1950s, there was an American government policy to shoot down unidentified aerial disks, but the disks retaliated. Many of our pilots died, he said, echoing Len Stringfield's statement, which forced an end to our shoot-down policy. Andy Kistner said he learned that President Harry S. Truman ordered a policy of denial in the interests of national security about all UFO crash retrievals, a classified executive order that allegedly is still in force to this day. And tonight, I'm going to present information about the possible nature of those U.S. attacks, the disk retaliation, and other phenomena linked to one or more non-human intelligences in those disks. But first, to underscore the reality of the extraterrestrial presence and government knowledge about it, I would like to share with you excerpts from my recent videotaped interview with one of the few military sources in my career who has been willing to talk on the record with his name, with his military background, about extraterrestrial biological entities. His name is Thomas Coleman Shepard. He served in the United States Navy from September of 1975 until his retirement 20 years later in 1995 as an E-7 Chief Petty Officer, Chief Yeoman. He has been married to the same woman for 22 years. The Shepards have 2 children, and their home is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I have been there several times. Tom's 50th birthday is this year, and he now wants to go on the record about his extraterrestrial knowledge because he told me when he contacted me in February, quote, "I cannot believe our government is still keeping it a secret," unquote. He strongly feels that the public should be told the truth. He said, "Our taxpayers' dollars have been paying for this for a long time. We deserve the facts." Now, we're going back 30 years to Thanksgiving night in 1976, and Tom was stationed at White Beach Naval Base in Okinawa, Japan. At that time, he was a seaman apprentice to the staff of Commander Amphibious Group 1, and most of his work was clerical. He was in the administration building with 2 other men, Robert Topin and Craig Howard. Howard was mechanically gifted, and he liked to prove that he could get into sensitive areas that were off limits, including safes. And that Thanksgiving night, 30 years ago, Craig Howard had gotten into a vault that contained classified material and was yelling for Topin to join him. Tom Shepard watched as Topin ran by into the administration office that contained a vault of classified files. Shepard wondered what Howard had found that was so urgent. And listen now as retired Navy Chief Yeoman Tom Shepard tells what happened.
And I saw Howard and Topin go into the vault. And they were in there for about 5 minutes. And Howard comes out first, and Topin follows. And Topin's kind of got tears in his eyes. Well, this really caught my attention, so I was really astounded to hear, you know, this kind of reaction from him. So then Howard, he calls me over and he says, "Come on in." So I go in there, right, and it's a vault, and it's a small room, and it's got the filing cabinets and the safes. And it's got a table right there in the middle of the vault. The table's about the size of this, but square and taller. And on that table, he had this file laid out. And this file was, I mean, it was like all spread out on the table here, okay? And it had photographs and documents and the covers and everything. And he said, "This is what it's all about," and he handed me one of the photographs. And I looked at it, and I had no idea what I was looking at. It was an old black and white photograph. It had a old truck in it, and down on the ground, and you could tell they were out in the desert, was some sort of a creature. It looked like, well, what I would call now an alien creature. But I had no idea what I was looking at back then, so I said to Howard, "Well, what am I looking at here?" He goes, "Well, what do you think?" I said, "I don't know." He says, "Alien creature from outer space, you big dummy." And I go, "No, it is not." And he goes, "Oh, you're looking right at one of these, and you still can't believe it, won't believe it?" That's incredible. So I looked at that photograph, and I looked at another photograph that had them laid out on a skid, and looked at 2 other photographs, and they had a very dark black background, and one of them was a headshot, and the other photograph was of it an elongated shot on a type of gurney. And I looked at the documents, and there was a lot of you know, red ink with top secret. One of the words was magic, and magic was spelt with a J. And I even made a comment to Howard. I said, "Look at here, they can't even spell magic right. They spelled it with a J." It just looked like an old file, but the gauge of the year would have to be from the 30s or the 40s, just based on the truck. The aliens sort of looked like that one down in the Roswell Museum, but different too. Because it's black and white, you couldn't really get a lot of tone with the kind of skin it had. But if I had to describe it at all, it would have been like snake skin in sort of a way.
Can you explain that further?
They had a whitish kind of appearance, but you could tell it had some color to it. And if I had to describe it as matches any other type of animal that I know of, it would have been like that of a white snake, say.
And could you discern scales?
Not really, no. No, but you could tell that they just looked like bumps, and who knows what they were. And it was throughout. But mostly like on the arm area and on the head area.
And was this being wearing any clothes?
No, you could tell that. And here are some renditions of drawings that I made of the photographs that I saw in Okinawa. And what you have here is a desert and the alien entity. Here's the guy in the jeans and the cowboy boots. Here's the truck, and here's the entity in the truck looking out. And in the actual photograph, though, you could barely make him out because of the angle of the sun and what it was doing from the slats to him. So I had to actually have this pointed out to me. This is what we called photographer number 1. This is another rendition. This is at the aircraft hangar. Okay. Pretty much, this is really a rendition because of the angle at all. I really am not an artist, okay, so I couldn't really draw it to the right angle. But over here is the military man in his khaki pants, his brown shoes, and this is the front of the aircraft hangar. This is the opening here. And I tried to, what really stood out for me in this photograph was the angle of the slants from the panes of the windows from the hangar, of the style of hangar that it was. Mm-hmm. And here's the alien that's mostly intact, and next to him, or it, is the other alien that was crumpling in a fetal position, and most of its side had been badly damaged. And here's the alien that's next to it, and I tried to make a rendition here of the crumpling and everything, but I didn't do a good job, really. But most of its head, as I recall, was badly damaged either through charring of some sort or other damage.
And burned.
Or burned, yeah. Okay. And here's another rendition. Now in the photograph, this is of course all black, okay? But what you're seeing is where the flash took the photograph of what you can see here, and it's a gurney in an elongated fashion, okay? And the alien entity laying on top of the gurney. And there you have it. And evidently in the same space, they took a close-up of the alien's head from the neck on up with the same black background. And here it is, as I best recall. And I tried to get as best to make it look as real as I could by not giving too much detail with the eyes. But the eyes, the sockets are very almond-shaped, and they're fatter up here, and they skinny down, okay? They're fatter here, and they skinny down. And the blotting I'm trying to describe here, okay, looks sort of, well, veiny, I guess you could say, or just bumps. And that was the best I could describe it here.
And this reminded you of reptilian?
Yeah, you could tell that it was sort of reptilian-ish, but at the same time, no, you really couldn't because of the black and white photo, okay? I do recall that its neck was, in comparison to its head, really this skinny, and it had a lot of wrinkles.
As if it were old?
No, as if it was just the way it was, the way it was.
But did that remind you also of a reptile?
Mm-hmm, yeah. I tried to make a description of how long its fingers are and in comparison to its wrist. Mm-hmm. This is a better drawing, okay, of its palm in this fashion, all right, without a thumb. If it had a thumb, it was this sort of a nib-looking thing here. And it did have these slanted tip fingertips, and on the tips, you could tell it was sort of a roundness, or what I call a suction cup. Linda, there is nothing on this earth that we know of that looks anything like this. It's not a human being. I'm telling you straight up. It wasn't a monkey. It wasn't an animal of any kind. It was like nothing that I had ever seen, and that's all I could say. It was definitely not a human. It was definitely not an animal that we know of.
What emotion did you feel?
I was in shock. I mean, what can I say? I mean, I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't even accept it at the time. It took hours for me to even accept what I had saw. Even with a guy that was older than me that was telling me, look at what you're looking at here, okay? These were not fakes. This was real stuff. I was overwhelmed.
Tom Shepard and his two Navy colleagues, Craig Howard and Robert Topin, thought that they had been able to enter that classified vault in Okinawa without anyone finding out, but on the Monday after that 1976 Thanksgiving weekend, the three men were summoned by a very angry Chief James Seeley Tom Shepard saw that the other two men had to put on their dress uniforms for some kind of punishment, and he was kept in office detention for several hours. But Thomas Shepard was never asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement that would swear him to secrecy for the rest of his life. 2 weeks after their vault adventure, Captain Seeley ordered Tom Shepard, Robert Topin, and Craig Howard to drive with him to a dentist at Kadena Air Force Base, about an hour from White Beach. Tom was put to sleep and never told what the dentist did. He thinks that the other two men were treated the same way, but his Navy records mysteriously never included the Kadena Air Force Base dentistry work. I asked Tom if the dentist might have implanted monitoring devices in their teeth. Tom said that a few years later he learned that was possible to do, and he also wondered if they had done something, planted something in their teeth. That tooth bothered him after the Okinawa dentist visit, and finally it was pulled in the 1990s back in the United States by a civilian dentist who asked Tom Shepard, quote, "When did you do intelligence work?" Tom said, "I never did intelligence work," but he said, "Linda, I could not tell that dentist what happened in Okinawa." Several months after the three men were taken to the Kadena Air Force Base dentist, Tom learned more from Craig Howard, that the vault photos and files that were stamped MAJIC on the back of the photos, on the outside of the files, and on the file documents, that the subject was a disc or disc plural crashes near Roswell, New Mexico in the late 1940s.
It was probably a couple of months after the incident that I finally came up to Howard and I said, okay, what was all that? And tell me what you know about what we saw. And he told me about Roswell. And he said that, he said two things, really. He said that he had heard of Roswell before, and that he did see Roswell in those documents. And that flying saucers, or whatever you wanted to call them at the time, did crash in New Mexico in the 40s, and that the government, or the military, whatever you want to call it, okay, recovered the bodies, and we've been hiding them ever since. I eventually transferred in March of '78. Topin got accepted for a naval officer candidate school program, and Howard transferred sometime in '77. And I'll never forget that day either.
What happened?
Well, he had made second class, which was E5, okay? And I thought he was doing really good. And there at the last minute, or within weeks of having to have gotten to re-enlist, he backed out. So I came up to him on the day he was leaving. He was in his uniform. And I said, Howard, you know, what gives? I mean, you know, life is good. You made second class. Why are you getting out? And he said, Tom, I just can't do it no more. I said, does it have anything to do with, he said, the vault, you know, what we saw in that? And he looked at me, and he got beet red, and he was shaking his finger at me, and he said, don't you ever bring that up to me again. And that was the last thing I ever heard from him. And I haven't seen him in over 30 years now.
Did you take it from that comment that he had been punished because of the vault incident?
I believe that, well, it's either one of two things. I think they jacked with him myself. I think they gave him threats. But it could have been just that he knew a truth, and it wasn't going to go anywhere. And he didn't like that.
Were you asked to sign any kind of a non-disclosure agreement?
No, never. Let's jump ahead to 1989. Unsolved Mysteries comes on TV, and it was a popular show then. And one night, they played, Robert Stack hosting, the Roswell incident. And I had no idea at the time that this was in books or had already been talked about. I was literally blown away. And I thought to myself, well, you know, if national TV is going to come out and blast it all over the place, what's to stop me? So at the time, I worked at a 3-star command there in Norfolk. It was ComNav Air Land. And I worked for the operations department. It's Code 30, and one of the people in Code 30 was a man named Captain Wood. And he had a person that worked for him who was a lieutenant commander, and I don't remember his last name. But one day, it was shortly after this was played on TV, the Roswell incident on Unsolved Mysteries, the subject of ETs came up, and we were just talking, and even though I had been, well, I'd run into a lot of trouble in other commands, not a lot of trouble, but, well, somewhat anyway, okay? We could get into that. But I had opened my mouth before, okay? And I was tired of keeping it closed. So I told this lieutenant commander who worked for Captain Wood what I knew, and I told him the whole Okinawa story, and the file, and the photos, and the whole thing. And I thought the guy was going to have a heart attack. He went into shock. He got really angry. He wanted to tape record me. He started making threats on me. We got to sort of a heated argument, and he said that he was going to have to tell Captain Wood about this. So I said, fine, tell him. So a couple hours later, Captain Wood calls me in his office. He says, sit down. Heard you did some talking today. And I said, yes, sir, I sure did. You want to tell me what you told Lieutenant Commander down there? All right. So I told him the whole Okinawa story. And he said, all right, I'm pretty convinced that you saw what you saw. But just so you know, we don't call them aliens. I said, we don't? No, we call them EBEs, for extraterrestrial biological entities. I said, all right, well, that makes sense. Then we had a conversation, and it was basically like this. I asked him why we had kept this under wraps for all these years, and what did it have to do with the military and the whole thing. And he gave me some descriptions about it. He said that since that period of time, and on up till, you know, present day, that
you're talking about the 40s to 1990?
yeah, the 40s to 1990.
Right.
Okay. That they had been using this, and it was all for good reasons.
They had been using what?
Well, you know, I've never really understood that either. They've been using the technology that the aliens gave them, or they've been using the crashed vehicles. Even though he said that, okay, it was just sort of inference that, yeah, the whole thing that we recovered, okay? So that's how I took it.
That our government was using?
Yes, what we had recovered.
For
purposes of military advantage. I asked him if the president knew, and he said, can't go there. I asked him how this might have an effect on society and religion. And basically the whole thing was people couldn't handle it. That there'd be too much shock. And we've got to maintain this under wraps. It could be disruptive to society. It could be disruptive to the Bible. And so, you know, I asked him, I said, well, you know, look, yeah, you have the Bible, okay, but it's not like as if people aren't going to, you know, people are going to just quit believing in Jesus or anything, okay? Come on. He said, no, but, you know, this could open the door to several other things in the Bible that, you know, we wouldn't want. And religions to have to deal with, okay? It could just open a door to many things that would be so disruptive, we can't go there. So you just need to keep this under wraps. You're not in trouble or anything, okay? And that's it. And if you say that we had this conversation, you can, you know, it didn't happen. So if you know what's good for you, you're going to keep this under wraps. You want to make chief, don't you? I said, yeah. All right, well, let's play ball by the rules then.
Did you ask him when the public and the media would be allowed to know?
No, probably never.
Is that what he said?
That's what he said. Probably never.
But that means the planet is living in a huge lie.
Yes, of course it does. Especially when you accept that when you're in the military. You accept that because you're working with secret material all the time. And you understand that the United States maintains military advantage over our enemies. And you accept that. That's an okay answer for a military guy.
But isn't that an incredible answer? Probably never, that the world would be kept in the dark forever? We
went there, and I respectfully tried to argue with him. I said, yes, when we recovered the aliens, okay, that was the 1940s. That's completely different from today. This is the 90s, okay? People would be able to handle it. And he said, oh, yeah, you think so? I said, well, could you handle it? No. Did it scare you? Yeah. Would it be old news in 2 weeks? I don't know.
How does that make you feel as an American?
Oh, that's a big question. How does that make me feel as an American? I think the public should be given the truth. And that's all there is to it. Enough is enough. For years, I've understood the need for secrecy, but I can't accept it no more. Not for this. Not to arrogantly and outlandishly just come right out with books and in media to say Roswell didn't happen. It hurts.
How long have American government and military insiders been enforcing a cover-up of the big secret about an extraterrestrial presence? Well, for at least 35 years, before Thomas Shepard and his Navy colleagues got into that classified safe in Okinawa on Thanksgiving night of 1976. But the timeline of government facts about extraterrestrial presence goes back to at least 1941, and probably in the military a lot earlier. The MJ-12 panel described the scientific probabilities of crash retrieval technologies and concluded that the disk technology was, quote, extraterrestrial in nature. This conclusion was reached as a result of comparison of artifacts from the Missouri discovery in 1941. The technology is outside the scope of U.S. science, and even that of German rocket and aircraft development, unquote. The line through from the Missouri indicates that this was a draft which was still being edited. Often in final documents, locations, dates, and names were and have been deleted or changed to protect this policy of denial in the national interest. And that neutronic device from the Cape Girardeau crash was allegedly shared with physicist Robert Oppenheimer after he took on the work of building an atomic bomb in the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, and apparently had the gift of extraterrestrial insight in that neutronic propulsion device. There is also very public evidence that the U.S. military on February 24th to 25th, 1942, a year later, attacked at least one, perhaps two craft described in government documents as celestial. America's involvement in World War II had officially been declared on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 2.5 months later, when air raid sirens went off throughout Southern California from the San Joaquin Valley to the Mexico border, residents wondered if the sirens meant another war invasion. Air raid sirens had been intermittent during the evening of February 24th, and then after midnight on February 25th, 1942, powerful searchlights aimed at a glowing object above the Santa Monica Mountains, shaped like a diamond, some eyewitnesses said. Minutes later, America's 37th Coast Artillery Brigade fired off 1,430 anti-aircraft shells at the UFO. This is an actual photograph taken by a Mr. Calvert, which was published in the Los Angeles Times. That February 25th, 1942 newspaper headline reported, quote, "Army says alarm real," unquote. And then 2 days later, on February 27th, 1942, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wrote a top-secret memo in reply to earlier information from General George C. Marshall, his Army Chief of Staff. FDR wrote to Marshall, quote, "Consultation with Dr. Vannevar Bush and other scientists on the issue of finding practical uses for the atomic secrets learned from the study of celestial devices precludes any further discussion, and I therefore authorize Dr. Bush to proceed with the project without further delay. This information is vital to the nation's superiority and must remain within the confines of state secrets," unquote. And the project, presumably, was what became the Manhattan Project to create atomic bombs in Los Alamos. 6 days later, on March 5th, 1942, General Marshall replied to President Roosevelt on Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit letterhead about 2 unidentified aerial craft retrieved by the Navy and the Army during the so-called Battle of Los Angeles. Quote, "As indicated in my February 26 memorandum to you regarding the air raid over Los Angeles, it has been learned by Army G2 that Rear Admiral Anderson, Director of Naval Intelligence, has informed the War Department of a naval salvage of 1 unidentified airplane off the coast of California that, unlike the raid, has no bearing on conventional explanation. Further investigation has revealed that the Army Air Corps also recovered a similar object in the San Bernardino Mountains east of Los Angeles, which cannot be identified as conventional aircraft. This headquarters has come to a determination that the mystery airplanes are, in fact, not earthly, and according to secret intelligence sources, they are in all probability of interplanetary origin." And that was early 1942. 5 years later, on July 9th, 1947, President Harry S. Truman issued a top-secret directive to General Nathan Twining right after 3 unidentified aerial vehicles shaped like pie wedges, not discs, crashed in New Mexico near Corona, White Sands Proving Ground, and east of Alamogordo. The dates were between July 4 to 6, 1947, and the directive said, quote, "You will proceed to the White Sands Proving Ground Command Center without delay for the purpose of making an appraisal of the reported unidentified objects being kept there," unquote. With these documents leaked to Bob and Ryan Wood, we'll have them posted at www.majesticdocuments.com, along with the other first and second-hand testimonies, it is clear that the American government was involved with UFO crash retrievals long before 1947 in New Mexico, and that means that Harry Truman, before and when he became president, he already had been briefed about classified knowledge and concerns of the non-human presence from the previous FDR administration. Half a century later, in 1993, New Mexico Congressman Steve Schiff asked the Government Accounting Office to investigate the controversial July 1947 Corona-Roswell UFO crash. The Defense Department did not or would not provide Congressman Schiff any 1947 documents from the Roswell Army Airfield. The excuse was that messages sent from the Roswell base in 1947 had somehow been destroyed without authorization. That DOD reply so angered Congressman Schiff that he held a news conference to express his frustration. Schiff told reporters, quote, "The GAO report states that the outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield for this period of time were destroyed without proper authority," unquote. Those messages would have shown how military officials in Roswell were explaining to their superiors exactly what happened. Congressman Schiff said, quote, "It is my understanding that these outgoing messages were permanent records which should never have been destroyed. The GAO could not identify who destroyed the messages or why," unquote. One of former New Mexico State Representative Andrew Kistner's most important sources was a high-ranking officer at White Sands Missile Range who died in 1998. In addition to the urgency of keeping all information about advanced ET technologies retrieved from the crash disks away from human enemy nations, the American government had other reasons for a strict policy of denial in the interests of national security. Government insiders saw on radar and in photographs how advanced aerial devices easily kept pace with our rapidly moving B-2 rocket tests. Government insiders knew the disk technology could jam electromagnetic devices and stop electric power grids. Government insiders knew the disks have a beam technology that can lift up and lower animals and people. Government insiders concluded at least one non-human agenda is to harvest genetic material from animals and people transported by that beam technology. And government insiders learned that the non-human intelligence has and will retaliate if attacked. In 1994, I received from Andy Kistner his unpublished book manuscript entitled Peculiar Phenomenon: Early United States Efforts to Collect and Analyze Flying Discs. He felt that the public should know what he had been learning from insiders at White Sands and his colleague at the Naval Research Lab. The facts were, he said, that UFOs had been seen and photographed during V-2 rocket launches and that anti-aircraft artillery was deliberately fired at those discs. I've been electronically reprinting Peculiar Phenomena at my news website, www.earthfiles.com, and we're now up to about part 20 or 21. And here is a brief excerpt, quote, "The most highly classified episode in American military history began with a series of events on May 15, 1947, that ultimately resulted in the crash and recovery of at least 2, probably 3, and possibly 4 extraterrestrial flying discs. This was accomplished by deliberate anti-aircraft artillery fire and surface-to-air missiles. On the issue of wedge shapes, triangle shapes, cigar shapes, round shapes, lens shapes, Andy said it was simply understood at White Sands. Disc technology was the phrase that covered them all. The U.S. Army's actions in using anti-aircraft artillery fire and surface-to-air missiles to attack the disc technology either caused or was a response to offensive, overt acts initiated by flying discs themselves. Whatever flying discs are, they are not defenseless. Their special weapons were, and even now, are unconventional. Flying discs were immediately defined by the United States military in 1947 as, quote, an enemy weapons system, unquote. By May 15, 1947, V-2 rocket tests at White Sands were underway, and that day, one was launched to an altitude of 84 miles. It carried instruments to measure cosmic and solar radiation temperatures, ionosphere measurements, and to do photo experiments for the Naval Research Lab. But the V-2 rocket crashed east of Alamogordo, New Mexico. And about that V-2 crash, the Las Cruces Sun News reported on May 16, 1947, quote, Lieutenant Colonel Harold R. Turner, White Sands Proving Ground commanding officer, blamed peculiar phenomena for the erratic test of a German V-2 rocket which landed only 6 miles east of Alamogordo. What actually happened during that May 15, 1947 V-2 rocket launch? Well, State Representative Andrew Kistner learned from his confidential sources that the facts remain classified and off-limits to public and media to this day. But Colonel Turner's reference to peculiar phenomena was his discreet way to avoid saying unidentified aerial discs. And how was that peculiar phenomena described at White Sands? Andrew Kistner says it was a radar target that instantaneously appeared next to the rising V-2 rocket. Immediately, the V-2 changed course. Kistner says his White Sands military source saw a photograph of a flying disc that had been taken from a camera mounted inside a V-2 rocket window, looking out at the disc pacing along the window. The peculiar phenomena caused the V-2 rocket at White Sands Proving Ground to change course, and the rocket crashed to Earth 2 minutes later, only 6 miles east of Alamogordo, 40 degrees off the V-2's projected flight path on May 15, 1947. An Army officer at White Sands Proving Ground told Andy Kistner, quote, the peculiar phenomenon object was defined as hostile in that it appeared to have affected the V-2 rocket's trajectory. It was, by every definition, an advanced foreign weapons system. Effort would be expended to guard against further intrusions, and high priority was assigned to collect a specimen of that technology for further analysis, covertly if possible, unquote. And that phrase, high priority assigned to collect a specimen of the technology, meant the creation of covert American government units to bring down unidentified flying objects that could pace launched V-2 rockets and cause them to veer off course. Those retrieval units operated under Project Moondust and Pounce that were responsible for securing the airspace over White Sands Proving Ground. One of their classified missions, Andy was told, was to aggressively bring down the advanced disc to study and potentially back engineer. Andy Kistner's source on this particular subject was a good friend who had previously worked for the Naval Research Laboratory. And right now is a brief excerpt of Andy Kistner sharing what the now deceased Naval Research Lab man told him.
He was a co-worker of mine, and he'd, back in the mid-60s, been taken to a facility somewhere in the state of New Mexico that was underground, and there was a warehouse, and there was a flying disc inside the warehouse, inside this bunker. And he noted visually and was told verbally by the briefing officer that this was one of several flying discs shot down at Roswell in 1947. He observed and was told was that it was shot down with 20 millimeter cannon fire. And he observed on the flying disc penetrations of the skin and exit holes through the top of the aircraft, through the top of the flying disc, and was told that it was a product of 20 millimeter cannon fire.
According to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, quote, in July 1944, the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance requested Section T of the Office of Scientific Research and Development to study anti-aircraft missiles to counteract the Japanese Oka piloted bombs and other suicide weapons sent against the United States in the Pacific. The requirement was for a missile to shoot down a plane at a range of 20,000 yards at an altitude of 30,000 feet, unquote. 4 months later, by November 1944, the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance assigned the Applied Physics Laboratory of the Johns Hopkins University in Silver Spring, Maryland, to undertake the development of radar-guided surface-to-air missiles. This project became known as Bumblebee, that produced several ramjet-powered missiles. Spurred on by his off-the-record military and intelligence sources, Representative Kistner studied newspaper archives and came to this startling conclusion. Quote, "It does not appear that flying discs were passive actors in 1947. Between May 9th and July 31st, more than 600 military and civilian airplanes crashed worldwide. That's an average of 7 crashes a day for 84 days, unquote. The peak of plane crashes seemed to come after a famous May 29, 1947 Juarez, Mexico explosion, which was reported as another V-2 rocket that veered off course only 2 weeks after the Alamogordo V-2 crash, and this time the rocket is 180 degrees off course. That means it's going one way and returns right on itself. But the truth was, Kistner says, the May 29, 1947 event was an American military test of a surface-to-air missile strike against an unidentified radar object. Again, it was White Sands commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harold R. Turner, who had planned a secret V-2 rocket launch for May 29th. Andy Kistner wrote in his manuscript, quote, "At 7:15 p.m. Mountain Standard Time on May 29th, 1947, it is believed that at least one Wasserfall surface-to-air missile or a modified Hermes A-1, complete with a 674-pound high-explosive warhead, was fired at one or more radar targets hovering to the southwest of White Sands Launch Row. 5 minutes later, at an altitude above 60,000 feet, the proximity fuse on the warhead detonated 10 miles north and slightly west of Mount Franklin. The explosion was witnessed by Major General John L. Homer, commander of Fort Bliss from 1946 to 1950. The El Paso Times reported the next day, on May 30th, 1947, that the first explosion occurred more than 10 minutes before a second explosion at least 25 miles further south. General Homer sent troops to look for missile wreckage and to investigate the first site and the second site. The surface-to-air missile's mysterious target, possibly crippled by the explosion, they think continued to fly in airspace, eventually impacting within 1 mile of the new Buena Vista Airport, only 6 miles south of downtown Juarez, Mexico. Local residents described a blinding flash of light followed by a tremendous pressure wave and the appearance of a mushroom cloud. The concussion of the blast was sufficient to crack windows 6 miles north of the crash site, while an electric clock stopped at the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, apparently due to the blast effect. Still quoting from Kistner, whatever the mysterious, and from the Las Cruces Times, whatever the mysterious radar object had been was not apparent because it was totally vaporized by the explosion. Small shreds of burned gray metal fused with molten sand and rock were found near a crater outside Juarez. The crater was 50 feet by 24 feet deep, but there was no V-2 rocket body, there was no peculiar phenomenon, there was nothing in the crater. No one ever reported if General Homer found anything at the first explosion near Mount Franklin. An effective cover story was immediately provided to the press that another V-2 launched from the White Sands Proving Ground had gone astray, experienced a total gyroscopic failure, flew 180 degrees off course, and crashed in Mexico. There was no explanation why the launched White Sands missile apparently vaporized, but the implication was that the interplanetary disk technology had retaliated when fired upon, and that retaliation was what vaporized whatever landed and made the crater. Another mysterious and important visual detail was provided by the editor of the Las Cruces Sun-News, who watched the May 29, 1947 launch and said he saw with his own eyes, quote, 2 first-magnitude stars near the missile before it headed down out of the daylight sky to crash. Andrew Kistner reports that within 72 hours of the Juarez incident, 29 airplanes crashed around the world, killing 198 people. The worst disaster was near LaGuardia Airport in New York, where a United Airlines plane took off, crashed, and burned, killing all 38 passengers. And while the government Civil Aeronautics Board investigators were returning from the LaGuardia disaster, an Eastern Airlines DC-4 went nose down and crashed, killing everyone aboard. According to an eyewitness of the second crash, quote, I saw the plane in a steep glide and several gleaming things like metal fell away from the plane as it hurtled down, unquote. Were those gleaming things more of the unusual phenomena that appeared on radar alongside the V-2 rocket launches and were photographed on film? More than one pilot who survived airplane crashes in 1947 said that their airplane was at high takeoff speed going down the runway, but mysteriously, there was never any lift under the wings, and they crashed. By June 15, 1947, President Harry S. Truman ordered a special board of inquiry to investigate American air safety. Among his appointees was Dr. Jerome C. Hunsaker, chairman of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and Dr. Hunsaker was also included on the top-secret Magic 12, Majestic 12 panel advising President Truman on the extraterrestrial presence. 2 days later, President Truman's Special Board of Inquiry about all of the air crashes held a secret session about how to prevent the tragedies. By then, only 3 weeks after the Juarez rocket vaporized, 146 people had died in airline crashes. 5 years later, on July 29, 1952, newspapers across the United States headlined, quote, Air Force orders jet pilots to shoot down flying saucers if they refuse to land, unquote. The U.S. Air Force revealed that, quote, jet pilots had been placed on a 24-hour nationwide alert against flying saucers with orders to shoot them down if they refused to land, unquote. And of course, there was no context for everything else that had been happening. And why did that happen in July 52? Why was this headline allowed? It was because of those overflights of Washington, D.C. twice in July of 1952 that probably had Washington running more scared than it had been in the previous 20 years. But official lies of denial about the extraterrestrial reality of the disks was still enforced in the interest of national security. One Air Force officer said that in the 1960s, he had seen a photograph of a crash disk in a classified military library. The file was about a retrieval near Aztec, New Mexico. A file document explained the secrecy because, quote, officials felt that only people in professional levels were capable of dealing with this information. Based on what occurred with the Orson Welles War of the Worlds radio broadcast, this information could create panic. Then it would threaten to break down the industrial complex that supports the military. It would obviously undermine it, and it could possibly reduce our ability to counter an attack by a hostile alien culture. But it was also clear that the intent of these particular beings was not known, unquote. That word intent. What is the reason that non-humans are here? In 1947, when unidentified objects suddenly appeared on radar next to the launch V-2 rockets that immediately went off course, perhaps no one in the U.S. government knew that around them another peculiar phenomenon was taking place that was directly linked to the intelligence inside the disk technology. That phenomenon is worldwide animal mutilations. For the last 27 years as a TV producer and investigative reporter, I have tried to find facts about that question. What does the United States government actually know about entities and technologies from UFO crash retrievals which have provoked an American policy of misinformation and denial in the interest of national security since at least the early 1940s. Simultaneous with the policy of denial, the American government and corporations have back-engineered the very same technology that they have denied and ridiculed to the public and the press as weather balloons and swamp gas. Back in 1983, while working on the documentary project for HBO entitled UFOs, the ET Factor, I met an elderly rancher who lived in Corona, New Mexico. He said that he had known Mac Brazel, the rancher who found strange debris on his land, and went to the Roswell sheriff to report his discovery during the 1947 4th of July holiday. That Corona resident told me, quote, "I heard there was a horrible secret about that crash." Perhaps the answer to the horrible secret is a major reason why there has been an official American policy ever since to deny ET existence at all costs. And that policy could have been provoked by the fear and shock President Truman and his close associates felt when they allegedly learned that dissected bodies and animal parts were found inside and near at least 2 of the UFOs that crashed in New Mexico in July of 1947. That startling revelation is in the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit document leaked to Bob and Ryan Wood. At the beginning of my talk about February 25th, 1942, and the artillery attack on the diamond-shaped object over Santa Monica, I showed that Army Chief of Staff George Marshall corresponded with FDR on Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit letterhead. During 1979, hundreds of cattle, horses, and other animals were reported dead with bloodless excisions of the same body parts in Colorado and surrounding region, exactly the same type of unusual animal deaths that law enforcement have been reporting since at least the early 1960s. I wanted to get to the bottom of the unsolved mystery and produce the documentary A Strange Harvest. The bizarre, bloodless animal mutilations were not happening only in Colorado. I learned that animal mutilations were occurring all over the United States, Canada, and many other countries, all with the same pattern of tissue removed from their bodies. An ear, an eye, a circle of flesh around the eye, half the jaw flesh removed, the tongue excised, and a vertical cut deep within the throat, as in this Sterling, Colorado case back in the summer of 1976. Half the udder was bloodlessly removed from this pregnant cow's white belly between noon and 5 hours on a bright noon sunshine day when the ranch owners were working outside only 1/4 of a mile from that pasture. Many times the excisions have had serrated edges, which veterinarian pathologists have confirmed were made with high heat. Perhaps the most startling discovery in animal mutilation research has been particles of pure bovine hemoglobin on animal bodies, such as this 2,000-pound black Angus bull discovered in Red Bluff, California on January 17, 1997. There is no known medical way to produce pure hemoglobin except in a laboratory centrifuge. But these particles were found around the bull's large circular chest excision. It was by investigator Jean Bilodeau, and she sent them to biophysicist W.C. Levengood for analysis. Infrared spectroscopic examination of the particles found on the bull's chest and testicles proved that the material was pure bovine hemoglobin. And here's the top spectra that shows the hemoglobin particles found on the bull's testicles. The middle spectra is from hemoglobin particles found around the chest excision, and the bottom spectra is from a known sample of pure bovine hemoglobin purchased from a medical supplier as a baseline comparison for bovine hemoglobin. Biophysicist Levengood said, quote, "How could a complicated lab centrifuge process be done in a pasture? Thus, it is unknown how or why pure hemoglobin particles would be a residue on mutilated cows." Mysterious aerial lights have long been seen and photographed over pastures where animal mutilations have occurred. On the left is a black and white time exposure photo taken by reporter Bill Jackson in Sterling, Colorado in 1976. And on the right, 13 years later in 1989, is one of the many mysterious lights photographed over Arkansas pasture mutilation sites by Jim Williamson, editor of the Little River News in Ashdown. The many reports of unidentified silent lights over pasture is why law enforcement looked to the sky for answers. Newspapers started illustrating what ranchers said they had seen, like this drawing in the November 2nd, 1980 Greeley Tribune in Greeley, Colorado. And the United States military had knowledge of something coming from the skies and killing and mutilating animals around the world since at least the early 1950s, according to U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Philip J. Corso, now deceased. He wrote in his important 1997 book, The Day After Roswell, that many advanced technologies that the United States government had retrieved from crashed non-human aircraft had been back engineered, and he was part of the process of getting that back engineering accomplished. One involved some kind of an instrument that could cut with light. And Colonel Corso said in his book, why did the extraterrestrial inhabitants of the craft have a cutting device like this aboard their ship? It wasn't until later when I read highly classified military reports of cattle mutilations in which entire organs were removed without any visible trauma to the surrounding cell tissue that I realized that the light beam cutting torch was being used by the aliens in medical experiments on our livestock. Before he died, Colonel Corso talked to me in private about the documents that he had seen in the Pentagon in General Trudeau's office in Washington, D.C., after Corso had returned from World War II assignments in Italy. He told me that he had read with his own eyes reports dated as early as 1951, only 4 years after Roswell, about animals found in several parts of the world with bloodless excisions and no tracks around them. And Colonel Corso said the classified report specified that the animal mutilators were, quote, extraterrestrial biological entities, unquote. The subject was so sensitive, he told me, because the United States government was scared that if the public knew something from outer space was able to pick up heavy animals in beams of light, remove tissue and liquids with advanced instruments, and then return the animals dead and mutilated to pastures, the Americans and the world would panic. Also, the advanced technologies needed to be kept out of the hands of human enemies and developed and patented by American corporations. Going back to the Corona rancher who told me there was a horrible secret at the UFO crash site in Corona, New Mexico, I think the horrible secret was that dissected bodies of some kind were found outside the crash between Corona and Roswell, while animal parts were found inside the crash vehicle near the Trinity site at White Sands Proving Ground. One of the many important documents gathered by Bob and Ryan Wood and displayed at majesticdocuments.com is classified Top Secret Ultra and entitled Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit Summary, Intelligence Assessment, dated July 22nd, 1947. This IPU document begins, quote, the extraordinary recovery of fallen airborne objects in the state of New Mexico between 4 July to 6 July 1947. On page 6 of the IPU document, 5 alien bodies are described as they were found with a crashed aerial vehicle at a site on the northern end of the White Sands Missile Range in July of 1947. The site is called LZ2 in the report, which means Landing Zone 2, on White Sands territory between the Trinity site and Oscuro Peak. Landing Zone 1 is defined as the crash site between Corona and Roswell. A third Landing Zone 3 is defined as 30 miles east of Alamogordo on or near the Mescalero Apache Indian Reservation. All 3 crashes occurred between July 4 to July 6, 1947, according to the IPU and the MJ-12 reports. On page 2, paragraph 4, the IPU intelligence assessment states, quote, on arrival at LZ2, personnel assessed the finds as not belonging to any aircraft, rocket, weapons, or balloon tests that are normally conducted from surrounding bases. First reports indicated that the first crash investigators from Roswell Army Air Force found that at LZ-1 was the remains of an Army Air Force top-secret Project Mogul spy balloon. When scientists from the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory arrived to inspect LZ-2, it became apparent to all concerned that what had crashed in the desert was something out of this world, unquote. Also, the IPU Intelligence Assessment paragraph 11 states, quote, as to the bodies recovered at LZ-2, it appeared that none of the 5 crew members survived entry into our atmosphere due to unknown causes. Dr. Detlef Bronk has been asked to assist in the autopsy of one well-preserved cadaver to be done by Major Charles Ray. From that description, the team was able to learn, and from photographs taken by intelligence photographers, the occupants appear in most respects human, with some anatomical differences in the head, eyes, hands, and feet. They have a slight build, about 5 feet tall, with grayish-pink skin color. They have no hair on their bodies and were clothed with a tight-fitting flight suit that appears to be fireproof. Some of the bodies looked as if they had been burned on their head and their hands. Their overall stature reminds one of young children. It is believed that there were male and female genders present, but that was hard to distinguish. Paragraph 12, quote, the most disturbing aspect of this investigation was there were other bodies found not far from Landing Zone 1, the Mac Brazel site between Corona and Roswell, that looked as if they had been dissected as you would a frog. It is not known if Army field surgeons had performed exploratory surgery on these bodies. Animal parts were reportedly discovered inside the craft at Landing Zone 2 near the Trinity site on White Sands Missile Range. But this cannot be confirmed. The team has reserved judgment on this issue, unquote. And it is not clear in these documents if the bodies dissected as one would a frog were animal, human, or non-human. The Truman administration already knew that their attacks on the disks provoked retaliations in plane crashes, electromagnetic jammings, and taking down power grids. Finding dissected bodies at one crash site and animal parts inside another craft must have scared President Truman and his colleagues so badly that they all agreed that the Titus lid had to be placed on the entire UFO phenomenon, a policy of complete denial in the interests of national security, while they tried to learn more and figure out exactly what they were up against. Thus, the reason for the National Security Act of 1947 that created the Central Intelligence Agency, the Majestic 12 Special Studies Group, and presidential executive orders that required everyone associated with the extraterrestrial investigations to lie, to misinform the press and the public in order to prevent panic and to maintain national security. In addition to the dissected, unidentified bodies and animal parts, there was another disturbing event that would also have provoked the Truman administration's decision to keep all of the real facts about UFOs and the disk technology and what was in them from the press and the public. The 1952 Majestic 12 First Annual Report about retrieved extraterrestrial bodies in paragraph F states, quote, biological warfare programs in US and UK are in field test stages. Discovery of new virus and bacteria agents so lethal that serums derived by genetic research can launch medical science into unheard of fields of biology. The samples extracted from bodies found in New Mexico have yielded new strains of a retrovirus not totally understood, but give promise of the ultimate biological warfare weapon. The danger lies in the spread of airborne and bloodborne outbreaks of diseases in large populations with no medical cures available, unquote. Retrovirus was not a common medical concept in 1947. Examples today are HIV, leukemia, and the deadly Ebola virus that causes its victims to hemorrhage blood from every orifice. Retroviruses are composed only of RNA. The RNA manipulates DNA to get into the cell genomes, which are then destroyed along with the host body. Paragraph 8, in Annex A, paragraphs 8 and 9 of the top secret MJ-12 first annual report states, quote, "The panel was concerned over the contamination of several special engineering detachment personnel upon coming in contact with debris near the power plant of the crashed object. That SED security detachment, I have learned, was from the 509th Composite Group based at Los Alamos with the Manhattan Project. One SED technician was overcome and collapsed when he attempted the removal of a body. Another medical technician went into a coma only 4 hours after placing a body in a rubber body bag. All 4 were rushed to Los Alamos for observation. All 4 later died of seizures and profuse bleeding. All 4 were wearing protective suits when they came in contact with body fluids from the occupants of the crashed vehicle." Paragraph 9, autopsies on the 4 dead SED technicians are not conclusive. It is believed that the 4 may have suffered from some form of toxin or a highly contagious disease. Tissue samples are currently being kept at Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is probably where they are today in July of 2006. Paragraph 13, in the opinion of the Senior Atomic Energy Commission medical officer, current medical equipment and supplies are wholly inadequate in dealing with a large-scale outbreak of the alien virus, unquote. In summary, it would seem that those special insiders with a need to know about the extraterrestrial biological entity presence have been running scared since at least 1947 in these discoveries, and trying to keep any signs of their fear and lack of control from the press and public. But at the same time, their goal was to get the extraterrestrial craft any way they could, including trying to shoot them down in order to gain and sustain military superiority over American human enemies and maybe their perceived non-human enemies with the advanced technologies. That technology, which Colonel Turner at White Sands described as peculiar phenomena, could suddenly appear in flight alongside those top-secret V-2 launch rockets and cause those rockets to change course and crash. And then when the government allegedly used weapons to forcefully bring some of the peculiar phenomena down to Earth, a White Sands missile evaporated and human airplanes seemed to crash at an alarming rate in the summer of 1947. President Truman called for a special investigation of the aviation crisis, and former New Mexico State Representative Andrew Kistner thinks many of those airplane crashes, according to his sources, were retaliation by the DIS technology for the U.S. aggression against the foreign discs. Perhaps that peculiar phenomenon was here or is still here only to monitor Earth for whatever reason, and has never intended harm until threatened by human military aggression. But there were the dissected bodies, including animals, referenced in the government's own highly classified Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit and Majestic 12 reports, plus the hemorrhaging deaths of security men who handled crash site bodies while they themselves were in garments that were supposed to have protected them. The animal mutilations are famous for being bloodless, without tracks, associated with mysterious lights and beams, and continue worldwide to date. More than 3,000 animal mutilations have been reported in Argentina and Chile since 2003. And what about all those human abduction complaints since the 1960s, also associated with mysterious lights and beams? Colonel Turner's peculiar phenomena have continued into the 21st century. But someone seems to have stopped discs crashing. Did the peculiar phenomena change, or did our military strategy, because payback was too painful? Thanks. Thank you very much. I don't know what time. I think I'm up. I am going to go to one of the back tables for questions, and I have only a half a dozen.